California has the largest death row in America, nearly 600 inmates waiting for a fate the state hasn't carried out in almost 2 decades. But behind the walls of San Quentin sit killers whose crimes were so shocking, so brutal, that they sealed their place on death row forever. In this video, we are going to look at the top 5 cases of inmates awaiting execution in California. Cimarron Bernard Bell. California's death row is packed with stories of unimaginable violence, but few are as cold and methodical as the tale of Cimarron Bernard Bell. Imagine a man who didn't just kill out of rage or impulse, but one who planned, calculated, and executed murder as though it were business. This is the story of a killer whose crimes stunned South Whittier in the early 2000s and whose name remains etched on the long list of condemned men awaiting execution. It begins quietly enough in the suburbs of Los Angeles County. On the outside, Cimarron Bell looked like any other young man trying to get by, but behind closed doors, investigators would later say he was consumed with greed and paranoia. Bell had a talent for manipulation, and he used it to pull people close before turning on them in ways that can only be described as ruthless. In 2003, Bell's violent streak surfaced in a way no one could ignore. His girlfriend, whom he was supposed to love and protect, became his first victim. The details are chilling. Instead of ending the relationship or walking away, Bell saw her as expendable, someone standing in the way of what he wanted. Her death would later become the opening chapter in a series of killings that seemed less about emotion and more about power and control. But it didn't stop there. Not long after, Bell orchestrated the murders of 3 men in South Whittier. These weren't random killings. Witnesses and detectives would later describe them as ambushes, deliberate, coordinated, and cold-blooded. In Bell's world, human lives were disposable, obstacles to be removed when convenient. The crime scenes told their own story. Police arriving at the locations found the chaos left behind, bodies riddled with bullets, silence filling the air, where only minutes before there had been voices and laughter. Neighbors peeked through blinds, horrified at the sound of gunfire echoing across quiet streets. South Whittier had been rocked by a predator who didn't seem to know the meaning of mercy. The investigation moved fast. Detectives traced connections, following a trail of evidence that pointed squarely at Bell. Phone records, witness statements, and the web of relationships he'd spun all began to unravel. Prosecutors later described Bell as a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else, someone who believed he could choreograph murder and get away with it. What made the case even more disturbing was the way Bell carried himself after the killings. While families of the victims grieved, he showed no sign of remorse. It was as if he believed he'd outsmarted the system, as though the lives he'd taken meant nothing. But the arrogance that kept him calm would be the same arrogance that sealed his fate. When the case went to trial, the courtroom felt heavy with tension. Families of the victims filled the benches, clutching photographs of loved ones who would never come home again. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece, describing a man who had orchestrated multiple murders as if he were conducting a business deal. The jury listened to the chilling details of how Bell lured people close, then had them executed without hesitation. The defense tried to argue against the death penalty, but the brutality of the crimes and the number of lives lost made it nearly impossible. In the end, the jury returned a verdict that would change Bell's life forever, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death. Cimarron Bernard Bell was sent to San Quentin, California's most notorious prison, where he remains on death row. Though executions in the state have been halted under a moratorium, his sentence is clear. When carried out, it will be by lethal injection. A quiet end compared to the violence he inflicted, but still the ultimate punishment under California law. For the families of his victims, the trial brought a measure of closure, but never true peace. Their loved ones are gone forever, their absence marked by empty seats at dinner tables, birthdays that pass in silence, and memories frozen in time. Bell's name may fade into the long roster of death row inmates, but for those families, his crimes will always remain painfully real. Looking back, what makes Bell's story stand out is not just the number of lives he took, but the way he seemed to view those murders as moves in a game he thought he could win. He wasn't driven by sudden rage or passion. He was deliberate, calculated, and merciless. And that, perhaps, is what makes his story one of the most chilling in California's death row history. Today, as he sits in San Quentin, years after the murders, the shadow of justice still hangs over him. He may have escaped accountability on the streets, but he couldn't escape the courtroom. And though California's execution chamber has been silent for nearly 2 decades, Bell's name remains on the list, a reminder of crimes so shocking that the law had only one response. But Samarin Bell is just one story among many. California's death row is crowded with men whose crimes are just as dark, each case carrying its own horrors, its own scars on communities. And up next, we'll turn to another inmate whose rampage in the 1980s earned him a terrifying nickname. The details of his crimes are as shocking as they are unforgettable, and his path to death row is one you'll want to hear. Mauricio Rodriguez Silva. In California's long and bloody history of violent crime, some names fade with time, while others linger, whispered like warnings. Mauricio Rodriguez Silva is one of those names. To investigators, to neighbors, to the press, he became known simply as the Monster. And when you hear what he did in 1984, you'll understand why. It started with family. That's the part that makes this story so disturbing. Violence among strangers is horrifying enough, but violence that begins at home, that strikes at the bonds of blood, cuts even deeper. Silva turned his rage not only outward into the world, but against his own flesh and blood. The year was 1984. California was restless, crime was high, cities uneasy. And then came Silva's rampage. In what prosecutors later described as a spree of pure brutality, Silva murdered 3 people in a shocking sequence of violence. Among his victims was his own half-sister, a young woman who should have been safe with him, but instead became a target. The killings were gruesome, each marked by a kind of overkill that stunned those who saw the aftermath. It wasn't just about taking lives, it was about domination, about inflicting pain in a way that showed total disregard for human decency. Witnesses and investigators who stepped into the crime scenes described them as unforgettable, places where the silence afterward felt heavier than words could ever capture. When Silva was captured, there was no denying who he was or what he had done. The nickname followed quickly, the Monster. It wasn't sensationalism. It was the only way people could describe the level of cruelty they had just witnessed. He didn't just kill, he destroyed lives, families, and any sense of safety his victims had in their final moments. The trial that followed brought even more horror to light. Jurors sat through testimony that painted Silva not as a man who lost control in a sudden burst of anger, but as someone who gave himself completely to violence. The defense had little to work with. The evidence was overwhelming, the brutality undeniable. The prosecution didn't need to dramatize. The facts spoke for themselves. One by one, the details piled up. 3 lives gone, a family shattered from within, a community left reeling. When the jury finally delivered its verdict, it was swift and decisive. Mauricio Rodriguez Silva was sentenced to death. Like all condemned inmates in California, Silva was sent to San Quentin, where he has remained ever since. His official execution method is lethal injection, though California hasn't carried out an execution since 2006. That fact has done little to soften the anger or the grief of those left behind. For the families of his victims, his presence on death row is a reminder of justice rendered but not yet carried out. Today, Silva sits in the same prison as hundreds of other condemned men. Decades have passed since 1984, yet the memory of his crime still lingers. His story is one of betrayal, of unchecked violence, of a man whose own family became his victims. And it's a story that reinforces why he will forever be remembered by the nickname he earned, the Monster. But Silva is not the only predator locked inside California's death row. Another man's crimes would terrorize Shasta County in the 1980s. A killer who not only murdered but taunted investigators with chilling phone calls afterward. His name became a dark legend, and his case a nightmare for the small community he preyed upon. Robert Edward Morey. By the mid-1980s, the quiet communities of Shasta County, California had grown uneasy. Women were turning up dead, strangled, their lives cut short in brutal and intimate attacks. But what truly set this case apart wasn't just the killings, it was the killer's disturbing game afterward, a taunt that would make investigators' blood run cold. Robert Edward Morey wasn't a man who blended into the shadows easily. To the outside world, he seemed ordinary enough, working odd jobs, drifting from one place to the next. But behind that facade was a twisted compulsion not only to kill, but to manipulate the very people trying to stop him. Between 1985 and 1987, Morey strangled women in Shasta County, each murder escalating the fear that a predator was on the loose. The scenes were chilling. Investigators described signs of violence, but also a strange, deliberate silence left behind. No robbery, no obvious motive. Just women who'd been alive one moment and gone the next. Communities locked their doors, women avoided walking alone, and whispers of a serial killer spread through the small towns. But Morey wasn't content with murder alone. He wanted control of the investigation too. After the killings, police began receiving anonymous phone calls, tips, supposedly from someone trying to help. But these weren't helpful at all. They were red herrings, bizarre and misleading clues meant to send detectives in the wrong direction. It was a cruel game. Morey was both the killer and the informant, orchestrating the chaos from both sides. The media dubbed him the tipster killer. The nickname stuck because that's exactly what he did: kill, then call. Detectives pieced together the phone records, realizing the anonymous voice on the other end of the line wasn't some concerned citizen. It was the very man they were hunting. When they finally arrested Morey, the community exhaled with relief, but the horror of what he had done was only beginning to sink in. Court proceedings revealed a cold and calculating mind. Morey wasn't lashing out in sudden fits of anger. He was deliberate, using strangulation, a personal, up-close method that left no doubt about intent. Then, he twisted the knife psychologically by inserting himself into the investigation, as if daring law enforcement to catch him. At trial, the weight of evidence was crushing. The prosecution laid out the timeline of killings and the manipulative phone calls. Jurors listened as recordings of his false tips were played back, a haunting reminder of how he toyed with authorities while bodies piled up. Families of the victims sat through it all, their grief compounded by the knowledge that this man hadn't just killed their loved ones, he'd mocked the system meant to deliver justice. When the guilty verdict was read, Morey's fate was sealed. The judge sentenced him to death, and like so many others, he was sent to San Quentin. His official method of execution is lethal injection, though California's moratorium means his sentence has never been carried out. Still, his place on death row stands as recognition of the sheer cruelty of his crimes. Decades later, Morey remains behind bars, his story a grim reminder of how killers sometimes seek not just to take lives, but to control the narrative, to insert themselves into the very story of their crimes. The tipster killer played his twisted game, but in the end, the game caught up to him. And as Morey sits condemned, another man waits on the same row, someone whose name is tied to one of Oakland's deadliest mass murders. His rampage turned a quiet home into a scene of unspeakable carnage, leaving behind scars the city has never forgotten. David Esco, Oakland, California, 1986. A city already wrestling with drugs, gangs, and poverty was about to experience one of its darkest and most unforgettable nights. That year, David Esco Welch, known on the streets as Moochie, walked into a home and unleashed a level of violence so staggering that it would go down as one of the deadliest mass murders in the city's history. 6 people were slaughtered in cold blood. It wasn't a crime of passion, nor was it a split-second snap. What Welch carried out was deliberate, targeted, and merciless. The victims weren't strangers. They were people he knew, tied by threads of community and circumstance. And that made the betrayal all the more chilling. The crime unfolded inside a modest Oakland home, a place where family and friends had gathered for what should have been an ordinary evening. But when Welch forced his way in, everything changed. Witnesses later described hearing the blasts of gunfire echoing into the night, each shot silencing voices that had only moments earlier been filled with laughter and conversation. 6 lives were erased in a matter of minutes. Men and women who had hopes, routines, and futures were suddenly gone. The brutality of the attack stunned Oakland. Neighbors who peeked outside afterwards spoke of confusion, sirens racing in, officers running, yellow tape unfurling around a home that would forever be remembered as a sight of horror. Detectives arriving on the scene were met with carnage. The rooms inside bore witness to chaos and fear. There was no doubt that this was not random. This was personal, and it was carried out by a man whose nickname, Moochie, belied the ruthless killer he had become. As the investigation unfolded, all roads led back to Welch. Witness testimony, ballistics, and the sheer audacity of the crime made it impossible for him to hide. Within days, he was in custody, facing a mountain of evidence and a community crying out for justice. The trial that followed would drag the families of the victims through every painful detail. Jurors sat stone-faced as prosecutors described how Welch stormed that Oakland home and opened fire without hesitation, cutting down 6 people in cold blood. The defense offered explanations, hints of a troubled past, but nothing could outweigh the horror of what had been done. For the families of the slain, every day in court was a reminder of the empty seats at their tables, of birthdays and holidays that would never again be the same. They listened as the prosecution painted a portrait of a man consumed by rage, willing to wipe out an entire gathering just to make his point. When the verdict came back, there was little surprise. Guilty on all counts. The punishment, death. Like so many before him, Welch was sent to San Quentin, where he remains on death row. His official method of execution is lethal injection, though the state's moratorium means his sentence has not yet been carried out. But for Oakland, the scars never fully healed. 6 people gone in a single night left a hole in the city's memory, a story retold whenever conversations turned to violence and its aftermath. Welch's rampage wasn't just another crime. It was a massacre that rattled an entire community and stands to this day as one of its darkest moments. And while David Moochie Welch waits on death row, his name forever tied to that night in 1986, another killer sits in San Quentin whose crimes were just as terrifying, though carried out in a very different way. Instead of invading a home, he turned a freeway into a hunting ground, striking fear into anyone who dared to drive along the I-580 corridor. Charles Arnett Stevens, Oakland, 1989. The sun was setting over the bay, traffic thick along Interstate 580, headlights stretching like a glowing ribbon through the East Bay Hills. For most drivers, it was just another commute home. But for some, it would be their last drive. Behind the wheel of his car, Charles Arnett Stevens was preparing to unleash terror on strangers he had never met, turning an ordinary freeway into a killing ground. The first reports came in scattered, frantic. A driver shot dead in his seat, another car swerving violently before crashing onto the shoulder. Passengers screaming, not knowing where the bullets were coming from. Within hours, it became clear Oakland had a sniper, and no one on I-580 was safe. Over the course of the spree, Stevens killed 4 people and wounded several more. The randomness of it was what terrified the city most. These weren't targeted hits. These weren't enemies or rivals. These were ordinary people heading home from work, picking up groceries, or visiting family. For days, the fear was suffocating. Drivers hunched low behind dashboards. Parents avoided the freeway altogether. A trip that once took 10 minutes now stretched into hours as commuters detoured through city streets just to avoid the stretch of road where Stevens hunted. Investigators scrambled. Ballistics confirmed the bullets were coming from the same weapon. Witnesses described a dark figure in a car pulling alongside others before opening fire. The newspapers dubbed him the I-580 Killer, and the nickname spread like wildfire. Oakland had seen gang violence, robberies, and home invasions. But this was different. This was random death, carried out in public, with no warning and no apparent motive. When police finally tracked him down, the city exhaled. Stevens was arrested, and the chilling reality of who he was came into focus. Prosecutors later described him as a man fueled by rage, detached from empathy, who treated the freeway as his playground for violence. The lack of motive made it even harder to process. Why these victims? Why that night? To this day, there are no satisfying answers. His trial was one of the most unsettling Oakland had ever seen. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, their grief written on their faces. They listened to the grim details of how loved ones had been cut down in moments of everyday normalcy. Jurors were shown photographs of shattered windshields, cars riddled with bullets, and crime scene diagrams mapping the horror that had unfolded across a highway thousands traveled daily. The defense tried to raise questions about his state of mind, but the evidence was undeniable. The jury didn't hesitate. Stevens was found guilty and sentenced to death. Like the others, he was sent to San Quentin, where his official method of execution is lethal injection. But the sentence didn't erase the scars left behind. For Oakland, the I-580 shootings remain a haunting reminder of how quickly normal life can fracture. One man, one weapon, one stretch of road, and suddenly an entire city felt like a war zone. Today, decades later, Stevens still sits on death row. His crimes may not be fresh in the headlines, but for those who lost loved ones that year, the pain never faded. Every drive along that highway carries echoes of what once happened there, of the fear that gripped a city in the summer of 1989. And while Stevens waits in San Quentin, he joins hundreds of others whose crimes left California shaken. Together, their stories form a portrait of a justice system caught between condemnation and hesitation, sentences written but not carried out, death row growing more crowded as the execution chamber stays silent. If you found this deep dive eye-opening, hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime breakdowns. Let me know in the comments, do you think California will ever resume executions? Or is death row just a waiting game?